Many experienced early childhood trauma. Almost all had reached an identifiable crisis point. Most had studied the actions of other shooters, and they all had the means to carry out their plans, that with a commonality of all shooters. Violent video games, not one of the traits that shooters shared. Joining us now is Tian Wang, host of Gamer World News Entertainment. Tian, welcome back to the show. I take it you're going to agree with the study and say that violent video games are not the backdrop to the shootings. Go.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, there isn't really a lot of compelling evidence to suggest that violent video games actually begets violent crime. Now, what I will say is that back in 2015, the American Psychological Association made this connection between violent video games and like increased aggression, decreased empathy, and pro-social behaviors. But it's really important to keep in mind that the aggression that they study is not what we're talking about here. Aggression to them could be anything from like hurling an insult to somebody or offering them, you know, like giving them a little bit of a shove. So there isn't really a lot of research on violent crime that seems to connect it with video games. And to really hammer home this idea, I want to make 2 points. The first is that back in the 1990s, video game sales actually went up, and yet the rate of youth homicide went down from about 16 per 100,000 to 9 per 100,000. And this started around 1993. Keep in mind that 1993 was the first year that Mortal Kombat 2 came out, arguably the most violent game of its time. So that doesn't make sense. The second point to keep in mind is that if you look at violent crime and mass shootings, keep in mind that the violent video games that we manufacture in the United States get shipped overseas to Europe, to South Korea, to Japan, to Australia. And yet, you know, the frequency of mass shootings that we have in this country is a very distinctly American phenomenon.
I take your point.
I don't think it's fair to lay blame on the industry.
Okay, but look, I take your point, but other countries do not have the gun ownership and the level of gun ownership that the United States has. I mean, Australia, Europe, Japan, it's nothing like it is here. But let me ask you this. You may not be able to have a direct causal relationship between a video game and shooting up a supermarket. But at the same time, if you've been playing these games, and I've seen them being played, you sit there, you're shooting up everybody, left, right, and center. If then something happens in your life that could set you off because you've been playing these games. Do you see what I mean? It's not a direct relationship, but it could set you off.
I don't, like, the way that I look at this, you know, when I mentioned, you know, in the 90s that the youth homicide rate went down, I have kind of a bit of a theory on this. I call this like the pacifier effect. And the idea here is that if you have a baby who's like whining and crying all the time, you put a pacifier in their mouth and it shuts them up. But it's the same thing with video games. You know, if you have young teenage boys who could potentially go out and, you know, become hooligans or whatnot, if you put a video game in front of them and they're playing the video game and they enjoy it, then that time spent playing the video game is actually time keeping them off the streets. So I don't really think that you know, the case that you're presenting is actually the case. And the other thing that I would mention too is that it's kind of unusual for Donald Trump to actually single out the video game industry when this kind of violent like the amount of violence in video games is not too different from what you would see in movies as well. I don't really think that it's a particularly valid argument.
Okay, well, you've had your say and I've had mine, and we'll continue from there. Tian Wang, thank you very much indeed.